The auctioneer's gavel came down like a gunshot, and Cole Hargrove felt his stomach drop. He hadn't planned to bid. He hadn't planned to do anything that morning except buy a saddle blanket and maybe a bag of dried corn at the Redemption Falls trading auction, the kind of dusty, half-organized market that happened every third Saturday of the month on the edge of town, where ranchers sold off equipment they didn't need and farmers traded things they couldn't afford to keep. But then he saw. She was standing at the far end of the wooden platform they used as a stage, not standing freely, but placed there, the way someone places a chair or a barrel or any other object they intend to sell. She was young, maybe 18, maybe a year older. Her hair was black as crow feathers, pinned back with a single copper clip. Her eyes were cast downward, but even from 40 feet away, Cole could see that her jaw was set not in defeat, but in the kind of quiet fury that a person develops when they've been humiliated so many times, they've learned to make. Silence into armor around her neck hung a paper sign. Cole couldn't read it from where he stood, but the man beside him, a leather merchant named Dobbs, leaned over and muttered, "Indentured girl. Family owed debts. Father sold the contract 3 weeks ago. This is the second transfer." Cole's jaw tightened. "That's legal?" Dobbs shrugged the way men shrugged when something is technically legal and morally rotten. "Out here?" Mostly, the bidding was already underway. A fat man in a green coat, the kind of coat that meant money in a town where most men wore dust, was bidding $3. No one else was raising a hand. The auctioneer, a weathered man named Ferris, who Cole had known for years, was calling the number with an expression that looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Cole looked at the girl on the platform again. She had raised her eyes just barely. Just enough, and for one single second. Across the noise and dust and indifference of the market, her gaze met his. He raised his hand. $3, he said, and 1 cent. The fat man in the green coat turned around slowly, the way powerful men do when they're not used to being challenged in public. Cole Hargrove was not an impressive-looking man at first glance. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with hands that looked like they'd been carved out of old hickory wood. He wore no special coat, no silver buttons, just worn denim, a faded shirt the color of the afternoon sky, and boots that had walked more miles than most men in Redemption Falls had ever traveled. He had dark brown hair, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 4 days, and gray eyes that people sometimes described as calm and sometimes described as unnerving. Depending on whether they were on his good side, he looked at the fat man without expression. "You bidding?" the auctioneer asked, uncertain. "Already did," Cole said. The fat man's name was Elias Croft. He owned 3 businesses in town, a warehouse on the river, and a reputation for getting what he wanted. He stared at Cole for a long moment, the kind of stare that was designed to make a man feel small, and then he smiled slowly, like he was deciding whether Cole was worth the effort. $3.50, Croft said. Turning back to the platform, Cole looked at his wallet. He had $4.11 to his name. His mortgage payment was due in 6 days. He had a ranch that needed a new water pump and 3 horses that needed to be shod before the month was out. $3.51, he said. Croft turned around again. This time, the smile was gone. "You don't know what you're doing, boy." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Cole said. And the strange thing was, he didn't. He had no idea. He just knew that the girl on the platform had looked at him for 1 second with eyes full of fire and exhaustion, and something in his chest had moved like a compass needle finding north. Croft studied him. Then, with the casual cruelty of a man who has many interests and no patience for small annoyances, he waved his hand dismissively and walked away. The gavel came down. Cole Hargrove had just spent $3.51. Nearly every dollar he had on a decision he didn't understand. Yet her name was May Lynn. He learned that while the paperwork was being processed in Ferris's little wooden office off the side of the market, she stood near the door, not seated, not relaxed, watching everything with those dark, careful eyes. The copper clip in her hair caught the light. When she turned her head, Cole signed the transfer papers with the uncomfortable awareness that he was doing something he didn't have a moral Framework 4? He'd just bought a human contract. And the fact that it was to prevent someone else from doing the same thing didn't make the ink feel any cleaner on his hands. When Ferris handed him his copy, Cole turned to Mei Lin. "I'm not keeping you," he said. "That's the first thing you need to know." She looked at him. Her expression didn't change. "The contract says 18 months of service," he continued. "But I don't run things that way. I have a ranch about 4 miles east. Hargrove land. I need a cook and someone to help manage the house because I've been living on burned beans and stubbornness for 2 years. If you come and work, I'll pay you a wage. Small, but real. And the day you want to leave, you leave." Mei Lin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in English so precise it surprised him, "You paid $3.51 for me." 51 cents was for spite, he admitted. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, not quite. But the armor cracked, just slightly, just enough to see that there was something warm underneath it. "I see," she said. "Can you ride a horse?" He asked, "No, can you cook?" A pause. "Yes." "Then we'll figure the rest out," he said, and picked up his hat from the table, and walked out into the dust and light of the afternoon. And she followed him not because she had to, he somehow already knew, but because she had decided to. That was the first day. He didn't know then how much that decision would cost him. Not in money, in everything else. The ranch was not beautiful. Cole knew that. He'd stopped seeing it with fresh eyes years ago. But watching Mei Lin take it in from the back of his wagon that first afternoon, he suddenly saw it the way a stranger would. The main house was a single-story timber structure, functional and weathered, with a porch that needed 2 boards replaced and a front door that swelled in the rain. The barn was newer than the house, which said something about Cole's priorities. There were 4 horses, a working dog named August, 2 goats that had names he'd forgotten, and somewhere out in the eastern pasture, a small herd of cattle that would need to be moved to the high grazing land before the end of the month. The surrounding country was something else entirely. The valley opened up to the west in a sweep of golden grass and dark pine. The mountains behind it streaked with the last amber light of the afternoon. The sky above Redemption Falls was enormous. The kind of sky that made city people feel small and made ranch people feel, on the best days, like they were standing at the center of everything important. Mei Lin looked at the sky for a long time without speaking. "Houses this way," Cole said, and jumped down from the wagon seat. She climbed down herself before he could offer a hand, careful, deliberate, and followed him inside. The interior of the house was exactly what a man living alone for 2 years would produce, functional, sparse, with dishes stacked in a pattern that made sense only to him. A work table covered in papers and harness parts, and a smell that was equal parts coffee, leather, and the particular loneliness of a place that had forgotten what it was like to have more than one person's warmth in it. "The back room is yours," Cole said, opening a door to reveal a small space with a wooden bed frame, a folded blanket, and a window that faced the mountain. "I'll get a proper mattress from town next week. For tonight it's fine," Mei Lin said. He looked at her. She was standing in the doorway of the small room, one hand resting on the frame, looking at the window and the mountain beyond it. Something in her posture had changed. The rigid guardedness had softened, just slightly, the way a held breath finally releases. "You've been sleeping in worse places?" Cole said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded. I'll make coffee," she corrected, and turned away from the window, and walked past him toward the kitchen with the air of someone who has decided to take ownership of at least one small thing. And Cole Hargrove, who was not a man who was easily surprised, stood in the hallway feeling something he couldn't quite name move through his chest, like the first warm wind after a long winter. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, and Cole was surprised by how quickly it established itself. Mei Lin was methodical and quietly formidable in ways he hadn't expected. She reorganized the kitchen on her second day without asking permission. And when he came in for lunch and found everything in different places, he started to object and then tasted what she'd made, a slow-cooked broth with dried herbs from a small cloth pouch she'd carried in her coat pocket. Served over cornbread she'd made from scratch, and forgot whatever he'd been about to say. She learned the ranch's patterns faster than he would have predicted. By the end of the first week, she knew which pasture gate stuck, which horse was temperamental in the morning, and what time August the dog needed to be fed before he started voicing strong opinions about it. She asked questions directly, without preamble. Where do you keep the mending supplies? When was the last time this well was checked? Is there a reason you're storing the feed in the damp part of the barn? He answered all of them. The feed question resulted in a 3-hour reorganization of the barn that left Cole sweaty and slightly embarrassed about how long he'd been doing it wrong. What he noticed in those first weeks was that Maylin never asked anything about herself. She didn't tell him where she'd come from, not precisely. She didn't explain the debt that had brought her to the auction platform. She didn't mention family. She moved through the ranch like someone who had decided that the past was a country she was no longer going to visit. And Cole, who had his own country like that, respected it completely. They talked instead about practical things, and then slowly, gradually, about less practical things. He told her about the ranch, how he'd inherited it from an uncle at 24. When it was half-ruined and debt-laden, it's how he'd spent 7 years building it into something that was at least standing upright. She listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption. With her dark eyes focused on him in a way that made him sometimes lose his train of thought, she told him. One evening, that she'd come to America at 15 with her father and 2 brothers. That her father had been a merchant, clever and hopeful, and ultimately unlucky. That the debt wasn't his fault, or at least she said it that way, with a careful neutrality that suggested she'd had to work hard to arrive at that conclusion. Do you know where they are now? Cole asked. Your father. Your brothers. My brothers went north, she said. California. My father. She paused. The firelight was orange on her face. Her hands were folded in her lap, in that particular way she had when she was deciding how much to say. My father made the decision he thought would help. He was wrong, but he believed he was helping. Do you forgive him? Cole asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Do you have someone you need to forgive? She asked instead. He was quiet. My father left when I was 9, he said. Walked out one morning and didn't come back. I spent about 15 years being angry about it, and now I'm just tired of carrying it, he said. Maylin nodded slowly, like he'd said something that confirmed a theory she'd been quietly testing. Then you understand, she said, and turned back to the fire. And Cole sat in the silence of that understanding and felt something loosen in him that had been held tight for a very long time. Her name was Dolores Vega, and she arrived at Redemption Falls on a Tuesday afternoon in October on the back of a painted horse, wearing a red coat the color of a wound, and she was quite possibly the most striking person Cole had ever seen in his life. She was a landowner, the new owner of the Sutter parcel, 3 miles west of Cole's ranch, which had been empty for 2 years. She was 26, Tex-Mexican, dark-eyed, and radiated the particular confidence of a woman who had fought for every inch of space she occupied and won. She wore her dark hair loose and her opinions louder. Cole met her at the general store on her 3rd day in town. She was arguing with the clerk about a seed catalog order, and she was winning. And Cole found himself smiling at the clerk's expression. The particular bafflement of a man who has encountered a force of nature and isn't sure whether to run or applaud. You're Hargrove, she said, turning to him without warning. I've heard about you. They say you're the most stubborn rancher in the valley. You're probably being kind, he said. She laughed a real laugh, unguarded and bright, and held out her hand. Dolores Vega, your neighbor, as of 3 days ago. I know. Welcome. They talked for 20 minutes in the doorway of the store while the clerk recovered his composure. Dolores had plans for the Sutter parcel that were ambitious and specific, and Cole noticed, very sound. She knew ranching. She knew land. She knew how to read weather and soil and the temperament of cattle with the ease of someone who'd grown up doing it. He invited her to supper the following Friday, with the straightforward hospitality of ranch country, and she accepted with equal straightforwardness, and he thought nothing of it. It was Mei Lin who noticed first. Dolores came on Friday evening, and the three of them sat around Cole's kitchen table and ate the meal. Mei Lin had prepared a slow-roasted chicken with dried chiles and corn, a pot of beans, fresh bread, and talked for 2 hours about fencing and water rights in the coming winter and the particular stubbornness of the county land committee. Dolores was warm and funny and formidably intelligent, and she talked to Mei Lin with the easy directness she applied to everyone, asking about the recipe in the herb garden and whether the mountain-facing window in the back room made the mornings cold. Mei Lin answered everything with her characteristic precision. She was gracious, attentive, a perfect host by any measure. But Cole, who had spent weeks learning to read the subtle language of her expressions, noticed something. She was very still. The particular stillness that was not calm but was the containment of something that wanted to move. After Dolores left, Cole was washing the dishes and Mei Lin was drying them. And the kitchen was quiet in the way it often was in the evenings, a comfortable quiet, usually. The easy silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. Tonight the silence had a different texture. "She seems capable," Mei Lin said finally. "She is," Cole said. "No, you liked talking to her."
"Aye." He glanced at her sideways.
"She's good company." Mei Lin nodded once and put a dry dish on the shelf with a little more precision than was strictly necessary. And Cole turned the observation over in his mind and didn't know quite what to do with it. Dolores came back the following week, and the week after that, she and Cole fell into the natural rhythm of neighboring ranchers with compatible interests and plenty to discuss, sharing information about cattle prices, borrowing equipment, coordinating on the shared fence line along the western pasture boundary. Cole liked her. He genuinely did. She was direct and funny, and she didn't play games. And after years of mostly talking to horses and the occasional taciturn ranch hand, the company of someone who engaged with ideas and argued back with intelligence was something he'd missed, without knowing he'd missed it. But he also noticed during every visit the way Mei Lin moved through the space differently when Dolores was there. Quieter, more efficient, less expansive. She contributed to conversation when addressed directly and then withdrew to the edges of it, like a fire banking itself when someone opens the window. One afternoon, he came in from the east, pasture, to find Dolores and Mei Lin alone in the kitchen. Dolores was perched on the edge of the table. She never sat in chairs the conventional way, and Mei Lin was at the stove. And they were talking in low voices about something that paused when Cole walked in. "Don't let me interrupt," he said. "I was asking Mei Lin about her family," Dolores said, without embarrassment. "She was telling me about her brothers in California." He looked at Mei Lin. She was stirring the pot with her back to him, but he could see the slight tension in her shoulders. "She doesn't have to," he started. "I know she doesn't have to," Dolores said with a small smile. "She chose to." She slid off the table and reached for her coat. "I need to get back before the light goes. Cole, I'll send my hand over tomorrow with the post driver we talked about." After she left, Cole stood in the kitchen, and Mei Lin kept stirring the pot, and the fire crackled, and the silence was back. The textured kind. "You talked to her," he said. "About your family?" she asked, Mei Lin said. "She asks things directly. It's easier than people who try to approach things sideways and hope you don't notice." He thought about that. "Is that what I do?" She turned from the stove and looked at him fully for the first time since he'd come in. Her expression was composed, but her eyes were doing something complicated that he couldn't quite read, like a sentence in a language he was only beginning to learn. "Sometimes," she said, "but you also know when not to ask, which is different." She turned back to the stove. Cole stood there for a moment, feeling the warm confusion of having been complimented and unsettled at the same time, and then went to wash his hands. November came with cold rain and a wind that found every gap in old timber, and the ranch folded inward the way ranches do in hard weather, smaller, more concentrated, more intimate. The big storm hit on a Thursday night. 3 days after the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an afternoon, it came from the north with ice and violence, bending the pines along the ridge and driving sheets of frozen rain against every window of the house. The barn-held coal had reinforced the roof 2 months prior, which Malin had called useful foresight, and he'd called panicked guessing, and the horses were stabled, and the cattle were as sheltered as the East Valley could manage, but the storm knocked out the kitchen flue at midnight, filling the room with smoke and coal, and Malin spent 2 hours in the dark and cold working to clear it by lamplight. Both of them on the roof at one point in the driving wind, her holding the lamp and him working the chimney brush. Both of them soaked through and laughing, actually laughing. The helpless laugh of people who have been defeated by weather and have decided to find it funny. And afterward, they sat on the kitchen floor in dry blankets with cups of tea, because the kettle could be boiled on the hearth, even if the stove was temporarily out of service. The lamp was low between them. The wind was enormous outside. The house felt very small and very safe. "Tell me something," Malin said. She was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair down for once, loose and black and damp at the ends from the rain. "What kind of something?" "Something true," she said. "Something you don't usually say?" She looked at her in the lamplight and felt the particular weight of being looked at by someone who actually sees you, not the version of yourself you've curated for the world, but the one that exists before you've done the curating. "I'm afraid of being alone," he said. "I don't mean the practical kind. I mean, I'm afraid of becoming someone that no one actually knows, that I'll just get quieter and more hidden until there's nothing left to find." Malin was quiet for a moment. "You told me that on the third day you were afraid of burning beans," she said. "I think you've already stopped being that person." He looked at her. "Your turn," he said. She was quiet for longer. The fire popped. The storm moved over the ridge. "I'm afraid I made myself hard to love," she said finally. "To protect myself. And now, I don't know how to stop." The words hung in the air between them. Cole didn't try to dismiss them or soften them, because he understood exactly what she meant, had felt it himself. In the years after his father left, and his mother worked herself into silence, and he had learned to need less, and expect nothing, and call it strength. "I don't think you're hard to love," he said. It came out quiet and simple, the way true things often do. Malin looked at him. The fire was warm between them and the storm, was pressing against every wall, and her eyes held. Something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, but was. Somewhere in the landscape between them. "Cole," she said. "Yeah, thank you for the 51 cents. He laughed, the real kind, the surprise kind, and she smiled, and the smile was something he'd been watching grow for months. Small and careful and increasingly unguarded, and this version of it, in the firelight at midnight with the storm roaring outside, was the most beautiful version yet. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They sat with the blankets and the tea and the fire and the storm until it was nearly 3 in the morning. And then they went to their separate rooms. And Cole lay in his bed in the dark, listening to the rain ease, and felt the house breathing around him, both of them in it. Both of them warm, and felt something so enormous and unnameable he had to press his hand to his chest. Just to confirm his heart was still behaving, it was not. December arrived, and with it, a question Cole hadn't expected to be asked. He and Dolores were riding the fence line on her property, she'd asked, for his opinion on a drainage issue along the northwest corner, and the afternoon was cold and clean. The sky a flat silver blue that pressed down on the golden grass. "You know," Dolores said, reining her horse alongside his, "for a man who's perfectly good company, you're surprisingly difficult to know." Cole glanced at her. "I've been told that, by Malin." The mention of her name did something small and involuntary to his expression that he couldn't completely control. He felt it happen, and knew Dolores saw it, because she was the kind of woman who noticed everything and was honest about what she noticed. "Among others," he said, which was not untrue, but was not the direct answer she was after. Dolores looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she looked out over her fence line with the thoughtful expression of someone who has already figured out the answer to a question and is deciding whether to say it. Can I say something that might be none of my business? She asked. People usually say it anyway. I've been coming to your ranch for 2 months, she said. And I enjoy your company, Cole. I genuinely do. But I want you to know, because I think you're a decent man and decent men sometimes need things said plainly. I'm not the reason you light up. He was quiet. When you come in from the barn and she's in the kitchen, Dolores continued, you change. Not dramatically, but you stand differently. Your shoulders come down. You smile before you've even said anything. She paused. That's not what a man looks like around a housekeeper. That's what a man looks like around someone. He's Dolores, he said. I'm not trying to embarrass you, she said. I'm trying to help. Because I also think she hesitated, choosing the next words with the care of someone who knows their weight. I think she's feeling it too. And I think you're both being extremely careful about it in a way that's going to cost you both something if it goes on too long. Cole looked at the mountains, the silver sky, the pale winter grass. It's not simple, he said. No, Dolores agreed. She was indentured to you. She's dependent on your roof and your income. She's a Chinese woman in a territory that doesn't exactly celebrate that fact. And you're a man who is very practiced at not needing people. She pulled her coat tighter. I know it's not simple. I'm not saying act immediately. I'm saying don't let simple get in the way of true. Cole was silent for a long time. They rode the fence line. The horses moved steadily. The winter light was going slow and bronze. She told you things, he said, about herself. That first evening, a little. She doesn't do that. No, Dolores said. I noticed. I think she needed someone outside the situation to say things out loud too. Someone who wasn't. She stopped. It wasn't me. Cole finished. It wasn't so important to her. Dolores said carefully, and that the quiet weight of that settled into Cole's chest and stayed there the whole ride back. He pulled back. He wasn't fully conscious of doing it. It was the kind of withdrawal that happens below the level of decision, the instinct of a man who has spent a lifetime managing his own vulnerability by increasing the distance between himself and anything that could hurt him. He was still present. He did his work. He was polite and reasonable. But he stopped sitting at the kitchen fire in the evenings. He started eating faster and going back to the barn or the books. He stopped asking her the kind of questions that had become their particular intimacy. The ones that led somewhere real. Mei Lin noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. She didn't say anything. But the quality of her silence changed, the way a room changes when something is missing from it that was always there before, even if you couldn't name what it was. She was still precise, still capable, still gracious when spoken to. But the warmth that had been growing, the careful and tentative and incredible warmth of it, banked itself. And Cole felt its absence like a draft through a wall he'd thought was solid. 2 weeks of this, then 3. One evening he came in late from the barn, later than usual, and the kitchen was dark. The fire was low. His supper was covered and waiting on the stove ETOP. There was a small piece of paper on the table, weighted down by the salt cellar. I don't know what I did, but I would like to know so I can understand, or fix it, if it can be fixed. Melkel stood in the dark kitchen with the note in his hand and felt the full weight of his own cowardice settle on his shoulders. He'd been protecting himself. From what? From a woman who asked him questions by firelight in the middle of a storm and thanked him for 51 cents with a smile that had rearranged something fundamental in his chest. From the fact that 4 months ago he'd spent $3.51 on an impulse he didn't understand, and it had turned out to be the most important thing he'd done in his adult life. He set the note down. He went to her door. He stood there for a moment, long enough for the full weight of what he was doing and not doing to become clear. Then he knocked. She opened the door after a moment. She was dressed for bed, a simple dark dress, her hair down over her shoulders, her feet bare on the cold wood floor. She held a book in her hand that she'd clearly just set down, and her eyes were entirely composed, which told him She'd been expecting this in some form. "I got your note," he said. "I see that. You didn't do anything," he said. "It was me." He stopped, pressed a hand to the doorframe, looked at her. I got scared. She didn't fill in the silence. She waited for him to continue in that particular way of hers that was patience used as kindness. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Not just physically. I mean, I've been someone who doesn't let things matter too much. People, situations, because when things matter too much, you lose them, and it costs you more than you can afford," he exhaled. "I've been doing that my whole life, and I'm good at it, and was starting to realize that it wasn't working, and I didn't know what to do with that." Maylin looked at him for a long moment. In the lamplight through her doorway, her face was very clear, not guarded. Not the armor she wore in the early weeks, but genuinely open, which he understood was something she did not offer easily or often. "Uncle," she said. "Yeah. I told you I was afraid. I'd made myself hard to love, I remember." "You told me you didn't think I was?" She paused. "I have been thinking about that every day since." Something tightened in his chest, the specific tightening that isn't pain but is pressure. The pressure of something enormous trying to exist in a space that was built for something smaller. "Maylin," he said. "Yes, I don't know what the right thing is here," he said. "You work on my ranch. You live in my house. There's a contract with your name on it that I find reprehensible, even though I'm the one who signed it. There's every possible reason in the world that this is complicated, and I don't want to." He stopped. "You don't want to?" "What?" she asked. "I don't want to be one more person who takes something from you," he said. Without asking, the silence that followed that sentence was different from all the silences before it. It was not empty. It was very full, pressed full of everything that had been building since the day he'd raised his hand at an auction and changed both their lives with $3.51. Maylin reached out and put her hand on his, the one resting on the doorframe. Her fingers were warm. She held them there for just a moment. And it was not a dramatic gesture, not a sweeping thing. Just a hand placed on a hand in a cold hallway at night. But it felt too cold, like the most significant thing that had happened to him in years. "You're not taking," she said quietly. "You've been giving since the first day. I know the difference." He looked down at her hand on his. Then he looked at her. "I don't know how to do this carefully," he admitted. "Neither do I," she said. "But I think carefully is how we start." He turned his hand under hers and held it gently, like something that might startle, and she didn't pull away. And the lamp in her room threw its warm light out into the hallway. And outside the winter night was enormous and dark and full of stars. "I'm going to do right by this," he said. "By you? I want you to know that." "I know," she said. They stood like that for another moment, holding hands in a hallway. Two careful people at the edge of something neither of them knew how to name yet. Both of them deciding to step forward anyway. Then she said, "Good night, Cole. Good night, Maylin." She went back into her room. He stood in the hallway until he heard the door settle, and then walked to his own room and lay down and looked at the ceiling and felt strange as it was, improbable as it was, frightening as it was, something very close to joy. January was cold. February was colder. And then March came with mud and birdsong and the smell of new grass under the old, and something had changed between them that they were both navigating with extraordinary care. They had not kissed. They had not spoken declarations. What they had done was everything that surrounds such things. The slow, careful construction of a shared language that means more than its words. He started bringing her small things. Not gifts in the romantic sense. A particular book he'd found at the trading post that he thought she might like. It's based on something she'd said 3 weeks prior. A bunch of early wildflowers from the East Meadow, placed in the jar on the kitchen table without comment. A better lamp for her room, because the old one flickered. She started leaving him things in return. A warm jacket she'd mended, hung on his barn peg. A cup of tea on his work table precisely when he needed it, without being asked. A note in her careful handwriting on a morning he was heading out early for a long day. "August needs his left front paw checked. There's food in the pot. Be careful on the East Ridge." Mill was the "be careful" that he kept thinking about. the simple, unguarded care of it. They rode together for the first time in March. She'd been learning, quietly, without making a production of it, asking the hands for brief lessons on her days off. And one morning Cole saddled the gentlest of his 4 horses and said, "Come on then," and she did. She wasn't confident yet, but she was committed. And the concentration on her face as she learned to follow the horse's movement was something Cole found himself watching, more than was strictly necessary for safety. "You're looking at me instead of the trail," she said. "Without turning, trail's not as interesting," he said. She said nothing. But he saw, from the side, the particular quality of her smile, the one that she still didn't fully let into the world, that she still held close, but that he had come to feel was something she gave him that she didn't give anyone else. He thought about Dolores's words. Don't let simple get in the way of true. April brought the cattle drive to the high pasture, 3 days of hard work. Enough hands borrowed from neighboring ranches, the kind of labor-intensive, cooperative effort that range country ran on. Malin stayed at the ranch while Cole was gone, managing the house, the horses, the daily operations with the competence that had long since stopped surprising him and now just made him feel, every time he encountered it, a quiet and profound gratitude. He came back on the 3rd evening, tired and trailed dusty and looking forward to getting through the front door more than he'd looked forward to anything in years, not because of the bed or the hot food, though those were welcome, but because of who was on the other side of it. She was on the porch when he rode in. She'd heard the horses, he supposed. She was standing in the late light with her arms crossed against the cool air, watching him come down the track. And the sun was behind the mountains and the sky was that particular shade of dark, rose gold that the valley produced in April like a gift. He pulled up to the fence. She walked over. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Everything's fine," she said. "You look tired." 3 days of cattle and borrowed hands, he said. "There's food," she said. "And the tub is hot. I started heating water when I heard the horses." He looked down at her from the saddle. She was looking up at him. The evening light was on her face, and her hair was loose the way she sometimes wore it now at the end of the day, when there was no one to perform composure for just them. "Mei-Lin," he said. "Cole," she said. "I kept thinking about coming back here," he said. "The whole drive. I don't usually think that way." She was very still. The horse shifted under him, and the evening was enormous around them. "I know," she said softly. "I kept thinking about you coming back." He climbed down from the saddle slowly, and when he turned, she was very close, closer than their careful distance had allowed. Because she had stepped toward him without either of them marking the exact moment, he could see every detail of her face, the composed surface of it, and the depth beneath. The things she'd told him in firelit evenings and stormlit midnights and quiet morning kitchens. His hand came up slow, careful, asking permission in the gesture itself, and touched her face. Just his fingers, just her cheekbone, the lightest possible contact. She closed her eyes, leaned into it the smallest degree. And then, in the April evening, in the fading light, on the ranch where everything had begun with $3.51 and an impulse that turned out to be the truest thing he'd ever done, the world went quiet, and everything else faded as the distance between them finally, gently ceased to exist. May arrived. And with it, something Cole had been thinking about since December. He brought it up on a morning, when they were sitting on the porch with coffee, watching August investigate something in the fence line with great seriousness. The valley was green. The mountains had lost their snow above a certain elevation, and the air smelled like growing things. "I have a lawyer coming from town next week," Cole said. Mei-Lin looked at him over her cup. "For what?" "The contract," he said. "I'm having it voided." She was quiet. "It should have been done in November," he said. "The day I bought it, really. I didn't know how to do it without it sounding like I was telling you to leave, which was not what I wanted." "What did you want?" she asked. "I wanted you to stay," he said, "but free. Not because of a piece of paper, because you chose it." Mei-Lin set down her coffee cup on the porch rail with precision. She looked at the valley, the green of it, the long morning light. August was still invested in the fence situation. A hawk moved in slow circles over the eastern pasture. My father signed that contract to pay a debt of $40, she said. He thought it was 1 year, not 18 months. He thought it was domestic work, not— She stopped, pressed her lips together. It was not what he was told. I know, Cole said quietly. And you paid $3.51, she said, which is— She stopped again. This time he heard something unexpected in her voice, the edge of something that was trying very hard not to be what it was, which was grief. $40 brought me here. $3.51 changed everything. The 51 cents was for spite, he said again. The same thing he'd said on the first day. She laughed, and then, unexpectedly, the laugh shifted into something else, and she turned away from him, her hand going to her face. And Cole put his coffee down and moved to her. And she didn't move away. He put his hands on her shoulders from behind, gentle, careful, the way he'd learned to touch the world around her, and she was shaking. Just slightly, the particular shaking of someone who has been holding something enormous for a very long time and is only now, in the safety of this specific moment, allowing themselves to put it down. You're okay, he said. It was not a sophisticated comfort, but he'd learned that she didn't need sophisticated. She needed true. She turned, pressed her face into his shoulder. He held her both arms, fully, without hesitation, and they stood on the porch in the May morning while the hawk circled overhead in August, solved the fence mystery, and the valley went on, being green and enormous and beautiful around them. When she pulled back, her eyes were dry, but very bright. I want to stay, she said, because I choose it. Good, he said. Doy the contract, she said. Already arranged, he said. She reached up and fixed his collar, which didn't need fixing. It was the gesture of someone who needed something to do with their hands, something small and close and ordinary. To anchor themselves in a moment that was too large for stillness, he caught her hand when she was done, held it. They stood like that for a moment in the spring morning, holding on, both of them looking at the valley, both of them knowing without needing to say it that something had been built here. Piece by piece, dollar by dollar, storm by storm, silence by silence, something that had started with a stranger's desperation and a man's impulse and 51 cents of spite, and had grown slowly and stubbornly and beautifully into something neither of them had known they were capable of. 2 years passed. They were good years. Difficult in the ways that ranch years are always difficult. Drought. In the second summer, that cost them a third of the east pasture. A barn fire in October that they fought together through a long, terrifying night. A winter that lasted past what felt reasonable and tested every stockpile they'd built. Good in the ways that years can only be good when they're shared. The extraordinary, ordinary of two people building something together. Learning each other's rhythms and angers and fears and joys. Having the arguments that honest people have and finding their way through them too. Something stronger on the other side. Dolores was a regular presence. She'd become genuinely important to them both. The third point of a friendship that Cole had come to think of as one of the best things in his life. She brought her horse over on Sunday mornings sometimes, and they'd all ride the valley together, 3 abreast where the trail was wide enough. And she and May Lynn would argue about something spirited, and Cole would mostly listen and feel, with a kind of bewildered gratitude, the profound good fortune of his particular life. May Lynn had started growing things. The herb garden that had begun as a small effort in the first season had expanded dramatically, and then expanded again. And she'd partnered with the apothecary in town to supply dried herbs, and had quietly, methodically built something that was hers and real and financially independent from the ranch. Cole had watched this happen with pure pride and had not said more than a sentence about it, because she would have found more anything embarrassing. And he'd learned when to say things and when to let them simply be known. She had not left. She had chosen to stay every single day, which he thought about on the days when the ranch was hard and the weather was bad and everything was more complicated than it needed to be. She was still here, still choosing it, and that meant more than he had language for. On a Saturday in June, 2 years and 2 months after the day of the auction, Cole walked into Ferris's old office, now used as the county land records office, and came out with a piece of paper. He put it on the kitchen table that evening. Maylin was at the stove. She turned, wiped her hands on a cloth, and looked at it. It was a land deed. Hargrove land. The eastern 30 acres, the meadow, the herb garden, the path to the mountain. The place where wildflowers grew in March. That she'd never said she loved, but he'd learned from the way she walked there in the early mornings. Slow and unhurried, like a person visiting somewhere holy. Her name was on it, Maylin. She stood at the stove and stared at it for a very long time. He stood by the table and waited. "This is mine," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yours," he said. "Why?" she asked, and her voice was careful and low, the voice she used when something was almost too large to approach directly. "Because you chose to stay," he said. "And I wanted you to know that it's not the contract that keeps you here. It's not me or what I want. This land is yours, regardless of everything else. Regardless of anything." He paused. "You should have something that's just yours. Something no one can sell or transfer or take back." She looked at the deed. Then she looked at him. "Cole Hargrove," she said. "Yeah. You are the strangest, most stubborn, most quietly decent man I have ever known." "That's a complicated compliment." "It's meant to be," she said. She walked to him directly. Without hesitation, without the careful, measured pace of the woman he'd met at the auction, but with the full and deliberate warmth of the woman she'd become here, the woman she'd always been underneath the armor, and she put her arms around him, and he put his around her. And they stood in the kitchen of the house they'd made into a home and held on. "Thank you," she said against his shoulder, "for the 51 cents. "Stop thanking me for the 51 cents, he said. "I'll thank you for it every day," she said. "Forever if I want?" He laughed. She laughed. August, who had been sleeping under the table, raised his head and looked at them with the expression of a dog who finds human sentiment baffling but tolerable. Outside the kitchen window, the June evening was long and golden, and the herb garden caught the last light, and the mountains were dark blue against an orange sky. And 30 acres of Hargrove land had a new name on the deed and in the kitchen. A man who had once been afraid of needing anything held a woman who had once made herself hard to love, and they were both, finally, entirely, unguardedly found. Years later, when people in Redemption Falls told the story, and they did tell it, the way small towns tell the stories that make sense of things, they always started with the auction. "He paid $3.51, they'd say. And then he gave her 30 acres. And then everything else. The ranch grew. The herd business grew larger than anyone had expected, shipping as far as Denver by the 5th year. Dolores Vega became the most successful rancher in the valley, one of their oldest friends, and the informal godmother to every good decision either of them made. Cole rebuilt the porch, replaced the door that swelled in the rain, added 2 rooms to the house for reasons that became clear in time, but what people in Redemption Falls remembered, when they spoke of the Hargrove place, was not the size of the herd, or the quality of the land or the herb garden that became something of a local legend. They remembered the light. On winter evenings, on summer mornings, always warm and always burning, they remembered that it was the kind of house that was full, and they remembered that it had started, impossibly, beautifully, with $3.51 of spite.